Is Splatoon Raiders about to take the Splatoon property into the big time for Nintendo on the global stage? We know that historically Splatoon has done very well in Japan, and we'll look at some data to support that as the video goes on, but with news dropping recently that the Metacritic score from users of the game is extremely high, does this signify a change in the trajectory of the Splatoon series? So as I was preparing this video, this news has emerged, and it was quite interesting to see. The 9.3 user score on Metacritic is one of the highest for a video game, and certainly the highest current Nintendo video game user score on Metacritic. Now, having said that, we always need to remember the number of users that are being sampled, and actually this is quite a high number by Splatoon standard. But of course, as the numbers go up, it is very likely that the score will drop. And that's just a natural facet of people who are more keen on the game being the early adopters. And then as people try it on a whim, perhaps those people won't like it quite so much. And so the score will gradually descend. Still, we can see the comparison here. Previous games have had up to 1600 user scores, but overall the scores have tended to be much lower. The original Splatoon on Wii U got 8.7, and that, I suspect, was part of it being the shock of the new. 8.4 was the Splatoon 2 standard, and of course that reflected the fact that a lot of people were discovering it as new, whereas perhaps Splatoon 3 was less new to people and needed to do a bit more and didn't quite achieve the impressive results of the prior titles. Now Raiders currently is at 9.3. Even if it dips a fair amount and goes down to the sort of 8.7 range, that would still be a pretty good score, and you can see it's actually racked up more scores than Splatoon 3 did back in 2022. So it's already doing pretty well in terms of user engagement, if nothing else. Of course, that high user engagement might be an indication that perhaps a lot of people are trying to push the Raiders score up, and that would be a natural thing for fans to want to do. We know, as I say, core fans play early. There's also likely to be the case that people know that a dedicated campaign could maybe have quite a big impact, and that would get media attention, as indeed this has. And of course, if passion was all that was needed, then Metroid Prime Remastered and other major games would be significant hits, and we know that that's not the case. It's not necessarily the case, therefore, that just because there's a big Metacritic score, there's going to be a major groundswell of sales for the game. However, I do think it is particularly interesting because Metacritic is basically a non-Japanese phenomenon. It is mostly focused in America and the West. It's not something that most Japanese fans have access to in any major way. And that's significant, I think, because it's normally the Japanese players who are driving the popularity of Splatoon. So if we look at Japan versus non-Japanese sales data. Now, this is part of something that I've been looking at for a broader project, and I'll come back to this in a future video in the coming months. This is a very specific and quite limited data set, but it is interesting. So this is data drawn from April 2019 to March 2026. It therefore excludes key events such as the launch of Splatoon 2 and of Breath of the Wild, which you'll see is relevant later on. And this is only taking out information for where the games within a financial year have racked up more than 1 million sales, which a number of the games have, but not all of them had. So, for example, if Splatoon 2 had years where it had just 900,000 sales, those would not be recorded. However, the benefit of this data set that we're going to look at is that it shows the differential between the Japanese and the non-Japanese sales. I've aggregated them from a number of past financial reports, and as I say, there will be a future video where I go down into the whole data set in a lot more detail because it's pretty interesting. But for now, let's just have a look at Splatoon specifically. So, accounting for the limitations of this data, and please, if you do refer to this elsewhere, do refer to the fact there are serious health warnings to be putting on this data, but 53% of sales for the Splatoon games in that period were Japanese. Splatoon 2 and 3 collectively, because it was the only two games on sale, outsold the mainline Zelda games during this period in Japan. So there is a case to be made that, in fact, Splatoon is more popular than Zelda. It's a pretty dubious case given that we're excluding the massive case of Breath of the Wild, but even so, it also excludes the launch of Splatoon 2, so I guess you could say that Splatoon, at very least, is in that really top tier of properties in Japan. Now, Splatoon 2 sales were 36% Japanese, whereas Splatoon 3 sales were 59% Japanese. And I think there are reasons that we could imagine for why it is the case that in Japan, Splatoon 3 did particularly well. Generally speaking, Splatoon does well because it's got that strongly Japanese aesthetic in many ways. It particularly caught a trend in the late 2010s with the Japanese youth population. And also, with regard to Splatoon 3 specifically, we know that second games on consoles tend to have those smaller and more hardcore audiences. If that was more based in Japan, well, I could see why Splatoon 3 might have a much higher Japanese audience than Splatoon 2. It's also possibly the case that the audience in the West tends to pick up the games a bit later than in Japan. And of course, if we don't have sales data where the Splatoon games crossed the 1 million threshold, that might also affect things, because those years where the West had a slightly higher proportion would be suppressed in the dataset. At any rate, the question at hand now is whether this could all be changing, whether Nintendo could have found a way to push Splatoon out of its Japanese comfort zone and to give it more purchase in the West, and particularly in the Americas. There are reasons to think this might be a breakout moment. So the looter-shooter genre, which Splatoon Raiders seems to be part of, is pretty popular in the West. There's a sales bubble before the Switch 2 price hike coming, because we know that in September the price is going to increase to $500. Well, anyone buying a system right now and looking for the most popular hit current game on the shelves, they're going to see Splatoon Raiders, and so it might, just by benefit of being proximate to this price hike, be a game that gets some benefit of the doubt, especially since it's relatively cheap and compared to some of the other titles on the system. It will be a new Splatoon experience for many people. It's a new Splatoon experience at all, given that it's the first spin-off title, but it will certainly be something that is different from anything that people have played if they haven't really dipped into Splatoon much, except for seeing it in Smash or maybe interacting with it through Nintendo Today. And of course, we shouldn't underestimate the long tail effect of that kind of promotion. Nintendo has been putting a lot of effort into familiarizing people with Splatoon. That will include people who have recently come to Nintendo through the movies or through the emergence of the Nintendo Switch as a popular console. And of course, it being relatively low price means it is accessible. Now, that same technique was applied to, for example, Metroid Prime Remastered, and clearly in that case it didn't work, but that's not to say it can't work. I do think a part of the pricing was reflecting the fact that they really wanted to be a bit aggressive with this title, as well, of course, as reflecting the amount of content and ensuring that people were not too disappointed if they felt it should be a much bigger game than it actually is, although I think there is quite a lot of that. Now, is there any precedent for Nintendo actually breaking a very Japan-centric game out into the West? And I think there is a major recent precedent that we can look towards, and that is Kirby. Now, Kirby remains very Japan-centric, to be fair. Kirby Air Riders had a 51% Japanese ownership rate, according to the latest data that they put out. But do have a look at Kirby and the Forgotten Land, which over a course of several years managed to get to the point where it is very nearly at the same level as the all sales percentage for Japanese versus non-Japanese sales. That is to say that roughly the same number of people in the West bought Kirby and the Forgotten Land in the same proportion as any other game on the system on average. Now, that's a huge change from not just Air Riders, but Return to Dreamland Deluxe, which were very Japan-centric. And of course, Dreamland Deluxe did follow Forgotten Land, so this does seem to be specific to Forgotten Land, and its 3D, maybe more open and exciting aesthetic, I guess. But either way, it's clear that there is the potential for a game that hits right in the West, even from a property which is less renowned in the location, to do quite well. And so the hope must be that Raiders will be that game for the Splatoon series. What are the signs that we might look for in terms of it doing very well? Okay, well, we can see how much the Metacritic score sinks over the coming weeks. That won't particularly tell us a lot about the sales trajectory, of course, because that's going to be driven by passionate fans, and you never know if different campaigns will take over. I could easily see a group deciding to try to tank the ratings just because it's something to do. But either way, it will still give a sense of whether there is momentum there. Then there will be the potential for promotional pushes in the holiday window for various properties. Now, Nintendo has certain games which they really like to push. You're absolutely guaranteed there's going to be a lot on Switch Sports Resort, and probably even still older titles like Mario Party Jamboree plus Jamboree TV. However, if they decide that Splatoon Raiders is getting a bit of a feature, that would be interesting to see, and that might suggest that they think that there is potential to push it a bit further and not just have it be, as some of these games are, the kind of deal that's, a big deal over the summer and then fizzles out. Also, will they be linking it to other properties which have a strong Western appeal? Mario, Zelda, and I put perhaps even Metroid. I know Metroid perhaps isn't seen as a great success in its current form, but if you account for its very low Japanese sales, I think it's only about 7% on average for Metroid games in terms of their sales in Japan, well, in that case you can see that Metroid does have a slightly higher profile comparatively in the West, and it might be something to be interesting to link with Splatoon Raiders, given that both are at least very, very, very tentatively in the same shooting genre. I'm not saying they're similar in many ways, of course, but either way, if people were interested in Metroid, perhaps there might be some way that they might hop over to Splatoon if they see something interesting in what Raiders offers. Of course, we also will be able to see the exact spread of Japan and non-Japan sales as long as Raiders crosses the 1 million threshold, which I think it almost certainly will, and that will not be something we'll probably see until the May 2027 financials, unless, of course, Nintendo decides it's something they want to boast about before then. And I do wonder if there is the potential to have a Western-facing and a Japan-facing Splatoon set of variants going forward. And by that I mean Splatoon Raiders, if that does have a very strongly American appeal or Western appeal, or at least if it's more Western geared than most titles, I think that really incentivizes Nintendo to keep developing that game series as a separate concern from the core Splatoon line. And so the core Splatoon line might be something that appeals significantly in Japan still, but Raiders has a broader profile. I think that will be a really interesting split to develop, and we have seen this to some degree before. Mario games, of course, have a big appeal in both parts of the world, but Mario Kart certainly has a stronger Japanese base, whereas something like Luigi's Mansion is very much more something for the West. Whether that could happen here, I don't know, but it'll be interesting to see over the coming years how this takes place. Now, of course, the immediate thing that we might expect to see is some DLC. Let's just have a look at the cons and the pros of this. There aren't many cons, to be honest, of doing DLC for Splatoon Raiders. It would take time from Splatoon 4, and I think this has been a concern in the past. I suspect the reason that Animal Crossing New Horizons wrapped up the DLC as early as it did was because they just needed to put the resources into Splatoon 3, bearing in mind at that point EPD 5 was still balancing both Splatoon and Animal Crossing with large parts of the same team, and so it kind of made sense to cut their losses early, or at least cut their wins early. But having said that, I think things have moved on significantly. I have covered in the recent Splatoon deep dive the fact that essentially only half the Splatoon team from Splatoon 3 were working on Splatoon Raiders, and it seems quite likely that there is a group still working on Splatoon 4, and that means that there's plenty of scope for them to either keep developing the separate Raiders group, or even just use a sub-team to keep developing DLC. Now, the other option is whether Raiders 2 might be a better approach for them. If you look at things like Paper Mario, they tend just to iterate. They don't tend to do DLC for the titles, and that is one option. Having said that, I think there are many, many pros that we can see for the potential of Raiders DLC. It would keep the profile of the series high, particularly if Splatoon 4 is a little way off. It kind of tilts us towards there being near annual Splatoon releases, which, if you think about it, including DLC, there kind of has been for a while, near enough at least, but it would really drive that to a bigger extent. Also, if the game is a success, then you really want to keep up that momentum. And of course, it's likely to sell pretty well because a lot of Splatoon players are pretty dedicated. So I think there is a high expectation that it would do at least respectably. Now, of course, DLC always has a bit of a risk attached to it because you are limited to the amount of people who have actually bought the original game. But then again, it should be less costly to develop. And so it's something that they can probably budget around. It also is a massive opportunity to experiment, and the roguelike elements in Side Order really drew people's attention, and I think this team are very interested in experimenting because frankly there is just so much that this sort of paintball style mechanic can provide for, and I think they're only really scratching the surface of it. I actually think in many respects this is as big and as dramatic a mechanism as the original Mario jumping mechanism, because other games had had jumping before, but it really was perfected with Mario, whereas this does feel like it's new and it's open up to so many different possibilities. The potential for tactics games, for other types of games with Splatoon, I just think there's a huge potential there, and so it would be a great opportunity with the DLC to try something different. It's a particular chance for the younger developers. I have to say, one of my great joys of the game so far is actually those arcade games, and I absolutely love some of those arcade games. And of course, those were developed with some of the younger devs. I think those are really interesting in terms of how Nintendo are using their younger developers and the kind of approach they're taking, but I'll probably come back to that another point. It also would be a good test of the audience commitment. If you get a lot of people buying Splatoon Raiders, but then the DLC doesn't sell as well, that kind of suggests that there's a more casual profile to that audience. And that's not a bad thing. It's just data which they can take into account. I think it's clearly the case that with games like Fire Emblem and Xenoblade, they push the amount of money that they put into those games on the basis that they're going to make back a significant amount of that through sales of the DLC. I struggle to imagine that the Fire Emblem games DLC is going to be anywhere near as costly as the base game, even proportionate to its cost. And so I think they're probably relying on good sales of the DLC in order to allow them to be a bit more expansive and a bit more impressive in terms of what they do in the main games. Could Raiders end up doing something like that? It probably doesn't need to be fair, if it's going to do anywhere near as well as some of the previous Splatoon games, but it does give them something of an option. And I think DLC has become part of the core strategy for a number of these series. So in terms of forecasts, I'm going to say I think there's a 70% chance that we see Raiders DLC by the end of 2027, and probably a 30% chance that it's announced this year. As for the Japanese to American sales or Japanese to Western sales, I think we have to be cautious because Splatoon does have a very Japanese-centric profile, and of course the Switch 2 is still not quite as widely available as the original Switch was, and so there's a significant number of people in Japan who'll be buying that, particularly buying it relatively early. So I think we can say there's a 30% chance that there are fewer than 40% of people in terms of the proportions who are supporting it who are Japanese compared with the Western audience. That would still be a pretty big deal, maybe not quite as big as Splatoon 2, but I think Splatoon 2 achieved that over quite a bit of time. Remember, Splatoon 2 was 36% Japanese, but that does take into account the fact that it sold for a long while, and during the height of the pandemic when a lot of games were starting to push in new territories, and Nintendo had a chance to push it into the West to a greater degree. A quick shout out as well to the members of the Patreon on this channel who really do help keep the show on the road. And if you are interested in checking out the Patreon, there's quite a lot of fun stuff there. I probably need to organise it a bit better to be a little bit easier to see, as there's a lot of stuff that goes on there. But of course, a lot of that is early ad-free bits and pieces and maybe cut content. The big things, though, I'd say there's a lot, so this is not a complete sampling, but things like a video or podcast at this present moment on Nintendo's relationship with the Pokemon Company, podcast as well on what if Nintendo rebooted 3D Metroid, kind of the same principle as what they did with Other M, but in the modern day. Very, very big video on the life and times of Nintendo's founder, Fujiro Yamauchi, which I'm really proud of. A big think piece on Nintendo and pricing. There's quite a lot on there. So if you are interested, please do consider checking it out. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.